I know you've talked about your view that is the CHIPS Act just doesn't work at all. It's just this huge. It's a cash bonfire. There's I mean, so so like.
So a couple of reasons, why.
Yeah. So like when someone like Todd Young goes on and is like, this is the serious thing to do, and goes on, Mitt Romney, et cetera, why doesn't it work?
So there's a couple of things. There's the superficial objections that I have, which relate to just importing a lot of baggage, right? You got the vector. Why is that the same act that also says what the National Science Foundation has to do with respect to the racial composition or the gender composition of who wins NSF grants, right? It's in the same act. There's a lot of other baggage exactly in that same way, establishing basic regulatory and hiring standards for the companies who are recipients of that money. So, you could say that's noise and not signal. That's just, sort of backdoor woke stuff. It's a cost of doing business. I'm not so sure that it's that easily dismissed. I think that once you create the vectors for government agencies administering funds at this scale, it necessarily becomes a vector for ideological infiltration as well. So I do think it's a little bit of a conservative contradiction in kind to say that, hey, we support those policies by empowering the very agencies that have been vectors for perpetuating a lot of the cultural poison that we stand against. But as I said, that's the superficial objection. Right. I think the deeper objection is that it actually coddles American industry in a way that makes it less innovative and less productive. You look at the cost of capital of these semiconductor companies. I mean, whatever, as of when we're having this conversation, if it's not the most valuable company in the world, it's still among the very top. NVIDIA, right? Was, at least as of very recently, the world's largest company by market capitalization. Right. Look at semiconductor stocks over the course of the last, over the last several years. It wasn't the CHIPS Act that propelled them upward. It was increased customer demand. It was massive demand driven by artificial intelligence, demanding greater computing power. It was concerns about scarcity relative to that demand. And the lowering of that cost of capital means how much capital you have to raise or dilution you would have to take as a business in order to raise that capital. If your stock is higher, you have to take much less dilution to raise that capital. Pales in comparison to the amount of that federal subsidy anyway. So you got a company like NVIDIA, if it's a $100 billion company or a $2 or $3 trillion company, the ability to raise $100 billion and the cost at which you do that changed so dramatically that it pales in comparison to what the federal government might be providing through the CHIPS Act. But what it culturally does, I think, for a lot of these management teams is it focuses them on becoming, the lobbying of the government for their annual budget. Even though the overall cost of capital of the business has come down, the annual budget that they're judged on, it becomes lobbying the government becomes that core objective. And I think it actually stifles those companies from being as innovative as they possibly could be when their feet are actually held to the fire. And so my own view is that I think a lot of that industrial policy is self-defeating by the combination of coddling those companies and furthermore using the vector of government bureaucracy to perpetuate more of the very kind of poison, cultural poison, as well as inefficiency that we supposedly say we want to fight. And I think the right answer is you can't have that industrial policy without expansive power of administrative agencies to administer those funds. Instead, get the hell out of the way, which you could say is a old school pro-capitalism kind of point of view. And I don't think that that's something I apologize for, but I do think that understanding that that is a better policy that better advances the long run interests of American manufacturers rather than the short run subsidy model, I think is just something that is a little bit out of favor on the right, but I think the pendulum is actually going to probably swing back in the other direction